We'll start today by putting our book into historical context. Of course, if we go back to our sample book, we can see one of the features is that it's a tight back. So the leather is glued to the spine of the book. So when you open the book, the leather spine flexes. So here's an example from the late 1700s, and it does the same as our sample book. It flexes the spine, but of course the flaw in this design is obvious in that the spine has cracked over time and damaged the labels. The second label with the date has even fallen off. Now we'll look at an example that's at least 100 years younger, but it has a hollow spine. And when we open it up, we'll see that the book throws up and the spine doesn't flex like it does in the tight back binding, which means that the spine has survived much better. However, there is a weakness in this design as well. Here we can see an example of a typical late Victorian binding done on a thin calf. Trouble with the thin calf is that it's weak at the joint. It's been pared very thin, and it's very common for the spine to fall off of these books. So the next job is to back the book, that is to put the shoulders on the book. Now I'm putting the backing boards on the line that I drew on the outside of the book, and the line was the thickness of the board away from the spine, so that's 3 millimeters in this case. I put a little bit of saliva on the boards so they'd stick a little bit to help me get them in position. But I will spend a bit of time making sure everything's exactly where I want it. It's really important to spend the time at this step to get the boards lined up perfectly on the line and to have the round in the book just the way you want it. If you don't have the book set up in the press correctly, the backing job won't go well, and you can't really correct it, and it will always be a flaw with the book. So once everything is in position, it's time to tighten the press and start backing. So I always start with light glancing blows away from the head and tail. I'm not hitting the center of the spine. You don't want to flatten the central sections. I'm just going to go back and forth. I'm not going to hit where the tapes are at this point. And just start to get those sections on either side of the center to start to lean over. Once those start to go, then you can start to work towards the head and tail and start to move towards the edge of the spine as well. Now I know a lot of people, especially when starting out, are very anxious about backing, and it's because of the uncertainty. Small mistakes or deviations can quickly become big issues while backing. If some of the sections fold over on themselves, it's hard to recover from that. And so people worry about that. They've already invested a lot of time in the project at this point. If you are worried about it, I'd recommend the work of David Pye and The Nature and Art of Workmanship and the concept of workmanship of risk. He talks about how some of the greatest work or craft has been associated or is accompanied with this risk or uncertainty, and that is what feeds into the final result and makes it such a great piece of work. So instead of worrying about the risk and trying to avoid it, I think it's healthy to embrace it and understand that it's part of the creative process that feeds into producing a beautiful result. Now it's important to not try and overback the book. You're not going to get perfectly right angle shoulders at this stage, and it's best to finish up on the bench, putting a piece of board on the one side to protect the lower shoulder and putting another board into the upper shoulder and using a bone folder to crisp up the shoulders. The next step is to put the first lining on the spine, and that's going to be Scrim. Now I swapped to this press mainly because I was too lazy to trim the boards I was using, and the book wouldn't go deep enough into my other finishing press that I normally use. So the first step is to trim a piece of Scrim to the length of the book, or very slightly shorter than the length of the book. Now I'm fairly sure in both Matthews and Johnson their intention is to only line the spine with a piece of Scrim the width of the spine. However, in Kay he uses a piece of Scrim that extends past the edges of the book, and then that Scrim is inserted into the split boards and makes I think it makes the attachment to the split board stronger. So I like that approach, and so I'm going to follow Kay's approach. So we're putting a layer of PVA on the spine now, and now since we've rounded back the book we can go over the tapes. So I put a good layer of PVA on and then work the Scrim down onto the spine. Now, of course, when I say Scrim, I'm sure everyone knows what I mean. It's common to call it super in America, and some people call it mull. But so when I say Scrim, you know it can be mull or super. As you work the Scrim onto the spine, the adhesive will start to work its way through. So that's why I've started using a piece of rubbing down paper. Now just gently work the Scrim down into the shoulders so you get a nice crisp edge to the shoulders. This will make applying the next spine lining easier. So we'll swap back to my favourite bench press. Now we want to make the spine as smooth as possible. So to do that, we're going to try and reduce the lumpiness at the tapes by lining between the tapes with a thickish craft paper. So I'm going to start by cutting the craft paper to the length of the book. Now I'll cut a piece of paper the width of the spine from the very edge of the shoulder to the other edge. It's very important that the grain direction of this piece of paper run head to tail. Now I'm going to cut 4 pieces that correspond to the gaps between the tapes and to the head and tail. I numbered them so that I wouldn't get them mixed up. Before I adhere them to the spine, I'm going to relax them a little bit by moistening them. Maybe not quite as much moisture as I'm using here, but that's fine. Now I'm going to put another full layer of PVA over the spine. I'm going to try and work it into the little holes in the scrim. Now Matthews does point out that in your efforts to make the spine nice and smooth, you shouldn't overline the spine and make it stiff. In the long run, that will be detrimental to the book. So he suggests that you'd be better off with a little bit of lumpiness in the spine than to overline the spine. So I'm going to try and avoid doing that, but I do want a good layer of PVA at this point. And now I'll put the final lining on the spine, which is just one continuous length of craft paper. Now I think it's really important to work this final spine lining down really well. So just start with light pressure with the bone folder and then just gradually increase it until you're applying quite firm pressure and you work down that lining really well. Leave the book overnight for the spine to dry. Now hopefully it's going to be pretty smooth. We can get rid of any small bumps with a little bit of sandpaper. Don't sand too hard, and as soon as you can start to see through the lining, anything showing through, it's probably time to stop. And I may have gone a little bit overboard here because I couldn't see very well because the camera was where my head should have been. In preparation for making the tab that's going to go into the split board, we'll trim up the scrim and the cotton tapes. So I'll trim the scrim up to about 1/4 of the width of the book, or slightly over, so it's 35mm in this case. And then I'll trim the tapes to ever so slightly less than that. Now I always like to try and apply the adhesive to the side that's closest to the text. So I'm only going to put the adhesive on the inside half of this leaf, and then I'll put the tapes down, then I'll put a bit of adhesive on the outside of the tapes, then I'll bring the scrim down, and then I'll put adhesive over the top of that, and then fold the waste sheet over the top. And I'll bring the edge of the waste sheet right up to the edge of the shoulders, and make sure the tapes and the scrim go down into the shoulder. So use the bone folder to work them into the shoulder. Now some of this is the sort of detail that bookbinders can go to town on. Now a trade binder who's trying to work really fast will glue out the entire sheet. They won't do this half then half again, and that's understandable because time's money for them. But I'm not in a rush. This is a job for myself, and so I'll do what I've decided will give the best result for me. Now we're introducing quite a bit of moisture to the book. I'll start using barrier sheets. I won't point it out every time. Hopefully it'll be pretty obvious, these plastic sheets, but that's to stop moisture migrating into the text block. I'm just going to put some blotters either side of this tab and put a bit of weight on it. I'm putting a Reaming sheet there just to stop it sticking to the blotter, and then I'll put a bit of weight on it and just leave it for an hour or two, and then I'll take the weight off and then let it dry open. So leave the tab dry overnight, and now the next job is to trim it to size. We want to trim about 1" or 25 millimeters off the head and tail so that we can turn in the leather, the covering leather, and the width needs to be about 1/4 of the width of the book. Well, I know that my Slipboards, the opening is a little bit over 1/3, so I can go a little bit wider. I think I went 45 millimeters. So we'll trim that up. Now it's time to trim the boards. Now here's my new toy that I got at the Australasian Bookbinding Conference in Sydney a couple of weeks ago. It's got a little metal edge to this square, so I don't have to use my ruler. So I'll start by trimming up the spine edge of the board so that that's straight, and then I'll make a right angle, and then I'll trim the boards to length. So I'm going to put a 3 millimeter square on the book. So I'll measure the height of the book all around. I'll take the largest measurement and then add 6 millimeters to that. And I'm going to trim both the boards to exactly the same height. I'm not going to trim the foredge. I'll wait till I've attached the boards to the book and then trim the foredge. Now it's worthwhile just doing a test fit to make sure that we've got the boards to the right height and that we're happy with everything. Now when we apply the leather to the spine, I'm going to use 4 millimeter knitting needles to press in the joint groove. Now the width of the gap, it needs to be the 4 millimeters for the width of the groove plus 2 times the thickness of the leather. Now this leather is about 1 millimeter thick. It's a little bit less, but let's round it up. So I want a 6 millimeter, 4 millimeters plus 2 times 1 gap. So I'm going to make a little gauge to help me position the boards 6 millimeters away from the shoulder. Now I know some people would be comfortable just using that gauge to position the boards, but I like to put some registration marks in place and use those to position the boards, and then at the last moment I'll use the gauge to make sure that I've got that gap for the joint the right width. So I'll put plenty of registration, put the boards in position and put lots of little registration marks that I'll use to align the boards once I've put adhesive in the split boards and put them on the book. Now once I've put those boards on the book, I want to give it a pretty firm nip in the press to close up those boards. And I'm going to put some tins inside the boards to just help close them up. So I've just got those ready and put a bit of paper over those. Get everything ready. So I'm going to put the adhesive into the split boards and then try and get them into position as efficiently as possible. Because I'm using straight EVA, I really don't have much margin for error here. It's going to tack pretty quick. If you're a bit worried about that and it's your first time attaching split boards, maybe using mix, and I've certainly used mix in the past, it just means that it will take longer to dry. So maybe for the first couple of times, start with using mix to attach the split boards. Now I'm going to leave the book in the press for about an hour. With this EVA, it's probably not necessary, but you just want to make sure those boards don't spring open at the head and tail where the tab isn't. Now it's time to trim the foredge of the boards. So I'm going to put a 4mm square at the foredge, just slightly larger than the square at the head and tail. So the last thing we're going to do today is do the back corners so that there isn't a really sharp corner that will poke into the leather. So just trim at an angle of about 45 degrees, and I typically go down the length of the book twice the distance that I come out away from the spine. But I just do it by eye. Now I really hope you've enjoyed today's video, and I really appreciate you hitting the like button if you did. If you're not already a subscriber and would like to be notified about my future videos, please hit the subscribe button. Next week we'll finish the book. Hopefully it won't be too long of a video. We'll finally get on to doing some leather work, which I know a lot of people have been waiting for. We'll pick a nice piece of kangaroo leather to cover the spine and corners. So until next time, cheerio.